The coast of Alta California in the year 1838 was not the sun-drenched, golden landscape of the Mission Fathers' hopeful sketches. It was a place of wet, primeval terror, a land still finding its voice against the clamor of human ambition. Here, where the Pacific wind slammed against the mountains and the fog clung like a shroud, stood the great sentinels of the forest, the redwoods. They were titans, trees that swallowed the sun and the sky, and they cast the coastal valley of the San Gregorio into a perpetual, somber twilight. It was into this cathedral of wood that Elias Vance stepped before dawn, carrying an axe that felt less like a tool and more like an extension of his own burning need. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss, resin, and the metallic tang of the nearby ocean. Elias was 25, but his eyes, perpetually narrowed against the sawdust and the distant haze of smoke, held the weariness of a man twice his age. He wore buckskin, patched with canvas, the practical uniform of the ambitious pioneer who knew that the earth cared nothing for romantic trappings. He stood at the edge of his claim, a dubious line scratched onto a parchment that had traveled 3,000 miles from a notary's desk in Philadelphia, and stared at the tree he had marked. It was an ancient giant, a pillar whose diameter was wider than his wagon. Across its lower trunk, someone had gouged a deep, fresh gash with a heavy blade, a scar that wept dark sap onto the mossy ground. This was no logger's mark. It was a wound of defiance. Elias ran a calloused hand over the exposed cambium. He knew the story of the scar immediately. It was the mark of the Californios, the families who had lived under the fading Spanish and Mexican flags for generations. Specifically, it was the message of Mateo Ortega, whose crumbling adobe ranch lay 5 miles south, and whose cattle still grazed on what Elias now called his meadow. "They want a line drawn," Elias muttered, exhaling a puff of cold vapor. "They want to know where the wood ends and the blood begins." The American experiment, Elias believed, was one of progress, and progress here on the edge of the known world was measured in timber. In the East they built ships, libraries, and grand houses. Here they built futures. But the Ortega family, with their old grants and deeper roots, saw only a slow, deliberate vandalism. Elias raised his axe. He did not swing for the giant, not yet. Instead, he started on a smaller, though still magnificent, Douglas fir. He needed to clear a path for the oxen and the 2 hired men due to arrive from Monterey by noon. The first stroke was a dull, rhythmic thud that seemed to echo not just through the forest, but across the entire valley, a challenge thrown into the wilderness. The sound carried. Not just the thud, but the subsequent unnerving metallic shriek as the blade struck a deeply embedded knot. Across the valley, in a small encampment hidden beside a rushing creek, a woman named Elara lifted her head from her work. She was of the local Karkin people, though the coastal tribes had seen their numbers dwindled to a precarious few. Her hands, nimble and quick, were weaving the last strands of a basket meant to collect acorns, the sustenance of her people for countless seasons. Elara knew the man by his sound, Elias Vance, the Axeman. Her grandfather, Old Man Coayan, had told her that the white men who came to the coast were not like the Tawiskara, the traders who merely passed through. These Americans were stayers. They came with sharp-edged tools and sharper-edged documents. They named the rivers anew, and measured the trees not by their years, but by the feet of lumber they contained. She had watched Vance for a month, unseen. She had seen him map the creek, blaze his claim lines with white paint, and most recently, set his solitary square-hewn cabin where the sacred burial mound had rested since the time of her great-great-grandmother. The sound of his axe was a wound in the silence, and today it felt closer, more aggressive. She looked down at the basket in her lap, feeling the futility of her careful age-old work against the crude, devastating efficiency of his. Her people were not fighting an army. They were fighting a relentless tide that was washing away the very ground beneath their stories. Ilara gathered a small pouch of herbs and flint, leaving the unfinished basket beside the creek. She was not a warrior. She was a survivor. But today the silence of the forest demanded an answer. She would go to the boundary and speak the language of the land to him, the only language left to her. Meanwhile, 5 miles south on the Rancho Los Robles, Mateo Ortega was saddling his best mare, Piedra. Mateo was built like a stone wall, his face a map of the sun and the wind, his pride a matter of his grandfather's blood and the king's long-forgotten decree. His 16-year-old daughter Sophia watched him from the porch, her arms crossed over a dress of fine linen, a stark contrast to the dust-caked world around them. "You should not go, Padre," Sophia said, her voice sharp with fear she tried to mask with reason. "He is an American. They have laws we do not understand. He will claim you trespassed." "I do not trespass, Sophia," Mateo rumbled, pulling the cinch tight. "I ride on the land of my family. He is the one who trespasses. And the tree, the one that guards the spring, it is a marker for us. He must be reminded." The scar Elias had seen was Mateo's work, a desperate signal meant to look like an accident to anyone but an Ortega. It was a plea to the old ways, a ritual defense of the earth. Sophia stepped down, her polished leather boots crunching on the gravel. She was not afraid of the American's crude manners. She was afraid of his system. She had spent the last 2 years secretly reading imported American books, devouring the language and the laws that her father dismissed as the ravings of Norteño hustlers. "They will not listen to pride, Padre," she pleaded. "They listen to deeds and titles. The American surveyors will be here by the new moon. Our old claim maps are in Spanish. The new ones are in a language they can twist like rope." Mateo swung into the saddle, his movements heavy and resolute. "Then I will speak to him in a language he understands, mi hija, the language of a man protecting his home." He looked past her, towards the northern ridge. The wind shifted, and a faint, acrid scent of wood smoke, too clean to be a cooking fire, reached them. It was the scent of burning ambition. "Stay here, Sophia, and do not let the hands venture north of the great oak until I return." With a firm click of his tongue, he wheeled Piedra and galloped north, leaving a cloud of dust that was quickly consumed by the cold, coastal air. Back at his claim, Elias had paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. The air was getting heavy. He checked his timepiece, a heavy brass disc he inherited from his abolitionist father, a man who believed that the greatest freedom was the ability to own your labor and your land. The fur lay split on the ground, a respectable start. Elias was admiring his clean work when a shadow fell across the sunlight filtering through the canopy. He looked up. Standing silent and motionless on a moss-covered boulder was Ilara. She was wearing a thick, woven cloak and carried nothing but the look in her eyes, a look of profound, chilling judgment. "This land breathes," Ilara said, her English heavily accented but clear, carrying the smooth sound of the rushing water nearby. "The trees hold the rain. You cut their legs, soon the soil will run away." Elias was surprised by her presence and her language. He knew of the remaining natives but rarely saw them. He straightened, planting the axe head firmly in a stump. "This is my property," Elias stated, trying to keep his voice reasonable yet firm. "I purchased the rights. I respect the land, but this land must be used. It must support life." Ilara stepped down, her feet making no sound. "It has supported life longer than your father's father's father. We do not own the forest. We are part of the forest." She pointed to the huge, scarred redwood. "That one, we call it Ya'ah, the Watcher. It holds the oldest stories. To fell it is not a loss of wood. It is a loss of memory." Her words stirred something uneasy in Elias. He had come west to escape the ghosts of the East, the memory of his father's failed idealism, the rigid society that choked enterprise. He saw the redwoods as a challenge, a testament to the raw, untamed power he must master to build his future. "I need that lumber to build the mill that will employ honest men and cut the planks that will build the cities of tomorrow," Elias countered, his voice rising in volume, fueled by his own conviction. Progress is not the same as forgetting. It is building. Before Ilara could reply, a sudden violent pounding of hooves signaled a new arrival. Mateo Ortega burst through the undergrowth, pulling the mare up short just feet from the stump. He was breathing heavily, his face crimson, his hand resting on the smooth, polished handle of a hunting knife tucked into his belt. The three people, the pioneer, the Californio, and the native, stood in a volatile. The air was no longer just the scent of pine and salt. It was a choking, acrid haze. By the time Elias Vance reached the edge of the Ortega ranch, he was running alongside Mateo Ortega. Two rivals united by the shared, primal urgency of facing a catastrophic fire. Mateo had ridden Piedra at a reckless gallop, arriving first. The fire had consumed the small dry goods barn and was licking hungrily at the eaves of the main adobe structure. It was not a grand ranch, but a sturdy, low-slung building that represented generations of Californio persistence. Mateo was already shouting orders in rapid Spanish to his three ranch hands, who were desperately flinging buckets of water from the well. "Sofia, inside! Get the deed box!" Mateo roared, seizing an axe from the stable wall, identical in its hungry purpose to the one Elias carried. Elias did not hesitate. He had grown up fighting tenement fires in Boston. He understood the beast. "We need to break the line," he yelled, cutting through the Spanish. "The stable roof! If it catches, the house is next! We need to tear the burning wood away from the dry!" Mateo looked at the American, his eyes wide with panic and adrenaline. For a moment, the land conflict was suspended, replaced by the grim clarity of survival. He nodded once, curtly. "Juan, with the Americano! The roof!" The next hour was a brutal ballet of sweat and smoke. Elias, leveraging his strength and the sharp edge of his tool, hacked violently at the burning sections of the stable roof. Juan, a young ranch hand, followed, pulling the smoldering debris down with a long hooked pole. The fight was not against the entire fire, but against its relentless march. Elias didn't care about the Ortega legacy. He cared about the sheer physics of combustion. He fought with the efficiency of a man trying to save the potential source of his own legal trouble. If the Ortegas lost everything, their claim on his land would only intensify, out of desperation. Finally, they created a scorched earth break, a 5-foot strip of cleared ground between the stable remains and the main house. The fire, starved of fuel, sputtered and died down to smoldering embers. Mateo stood back, his hands blackened, his chest heaving, watching the smoke curl into the sky like a prayer of defeat. Sophia, his daughter, emerged from the house, clutching a small, iron-bound chest. She looked at the American who had just risked his life beside her father. Her expression was complex, gratitude mixed with suspicion. "Why?" Mateo asked, his voice raw, looking Elias up and down. "Why did you fight the fire that would have cleared your own path?" Elias leaned against his axe, breathing deeply. "A fire like this, Ortega, doesn't stop at a boundary line. It would have swept through your fields, then through mine. I protect my own investment." It was a cold, American answer, stripped of sentiment, yet undeniably honest. It was the language of commerce and consequence. "The price of the open land," Mateo muttered, as he turned to survey the damage. "You fight for the title deed, we fight for the memory."
As the smoke began to lift, Ilara emerged from the woods, having taken a silent, circuitous route to the ranch. She did not approach the main house, but went directly to the well, where Sophia was drawing water to douse the last hot spots. Sophia froze when she saw the native woman. Her father had warned her about the remnants of the coastal tribes, viewing them as wild, unpredictable shadows of the past. Ilara simply dipped her hands into the bucket and brought the cool water to her face, washing the soot from her eyes. She then began walking the perimeter of the scorched earth, her head bowed, reading the ground like an open book. "It started here," Ilara said, pointing to a small, isolated patch of burned-out brush 50 feet from the stable. Not an ember from a cook fire. It was deliberate. Sophia, who had been struggling to understand the fire's capricious path, frowned. Who would do such a terrible thing? Ilara lifted a small, charred piece of wood, not redwood, but a cheap, straight-cut piece of lumber, likely from a trail marker or a recently built fence. "It is not the fire's doing, Nina. It is a sign of fear. Fear turns to violence." She looked back toward Elias, who was now speaking intensely with Mateo near the ranch gate, their truce already fraying under the strain of suspicion. "The men who want the land to be empty," Ilara continued. "The men who want no California titles, no native claim, only a blank paper that they can fill with their own names. Your conflict and his, it makes an opening for the hungry ones." Sophia understood. Her father and Elias Vance, with their loud, proud dispute, were drawing attention to this fertile, undervalued valley. They were advertising the opportunity for those who operated outside the law, the men who saw the unsettled frontier not as a place to build, but a place to plunder. Ilara left the evidence with Sophia and walked back into the dense cover of the forest, silent and watchful. Sophia turned the charred wood over in her hand, the smell of burnt lumber clinging to her skin. The price of the open land, she realized, was not just paying the surveyor's fee or fighting a neighbor. It was vulnerability to every lawless element. The temporary alliance between Elias and Mateo dissolved entirely when the two hired men from Monterey finally arrived, not with oxen and logging equipment, but with a battered wagon and a stern-faced U.S. deputy marshal named Silas Rook. Rook was a heavy, deliberate man whose face was set in the permanent frown of official authority. He carried a heavy rifle and a pouch of official documents, and he had been dispatched to the coast specifically because of the escalating land disputes between the new American claimants and the entrenched California ranchers. "Mr. Elias Vance," Rook stated, dismounting, "you're ordered to cease all logging operations until the official survey of the Rancho Los Robles is completed next month. And Mr. Ortega," he turned to Mateo, "you are ordered to keep your cattle and your workers off the claim blazed by Mr. Vance." Rook had come to draw a line, but the fire had made a mockery of his authority. "Look around you, deputy," Mateo exploded, pointing at the scorched stable. "Someone tried to burn my family out. This American and his crew are the only new faces in this valley. Are you investigating this?" Elias stepped forward. "I helped put this fire out, Marshal, and my crew hasn't arrived yet. I suspect the fire was a retaliatory act, not by anyone I hired, but perhaps by another group of opportunists, men who are trying to destabilize the region." He shot a glance at Mateo, knowing his suspicion was shared. Rook looked unimpressed. "I don't deal in suspicion, I deal with paper. The law is clear. Until the boundaries are settled, neither of you can fell timber or expand cultivation. The penalty for contravening a federal order is forfeiture of claim, Mr. Vance, and imprisonment, Mr. Ortega." The terms were unequal, reflecting the new power dynamic of the American West. Elias faced a financial loss. Mateo faced the loss of his freedom and his family's home. As Rook was laying down the letter of the law, Sophia stepped forward, clutching the iron box. "Marshal Rook," she said, her English precise and learned. "The fire started with cut, dry wood, not a natural spark. We have evidence it was deliberate act by a third party." She handed him the charred piece of lumber Ilara had found. Rook studied the wood. A small spark of interest ignited in his weary eyes. "Well, that does change things, miss. It suggests a claim jumper, or a warning, but it doesn't change the boundary dispute." Sophia pressed her advantage. "We ask for a full investigation, Marshal. If the fire was an attempt to clear the land of both the Ortega and Vance claims, then we are not enemies, but victims of the same criminal, and the boundary dispute should be suspended until the criminal is caught." Elias looked at Sophia. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same drive that propelled him, but tempered by an understanding of the law and the land that he lacked. He had come to the frontier to escape bureaucracy, only to find the new frontier was ruled by it. "She speaks the truth, Marshal," Elias conceded. "The threat is shared. I will suspend my logging, provided Senor Ortega provides an equal suspension of his cattle expansion until this fire is accounted for." Mateo was furious at his daughter's sudden alliance with the American, but he recognized the cold logic of the situation. His position was too vulnerable to refuse. "The cows will stay south of the valley stream," Mateo said, his voice tight with humiliation.
The arrival of the official U.S. survey party was silent, methodical, and chillingly precise, a stark contrast to the passionate chaos of the fire. The day after the blaze, 3 men and a wagon appeared at the northern edge of the valley, their equipment gleaming brass and polished wood, the tools of a new order. Leading the trio was Tobias Thorne, a man whose clothes were too fine and whose spectacles were too clean for the brutal realities of the Redwood Coast. At 30, Tobias was a gifted engineer, trained at West Point, and assigned by the Department of the Interior to rectify the chaotic land claims of Alta, California. He was the literal embodiment of the cartographer's burden, the duty to impose geometric truth onto an organic, contested landscape. Tobias set up his transit, a complex array of lenses and leveling screws, on a ridge overlooking Elias Vance's burned fur lot and the smoke-scarred Ortega Ranch. He saw not a community, but a collection of unverified coordinates. "The map, gentlemen," Tobias murmured to his assistants, adjusting the lens to bring the distant scarred redwood into sharp focus. "The map must be the final authority. We are not arbitrators of blood or sentiment. We are the servants of the meridian." His instructions were clear. Verify the original Spanish grants, translate them into the American rectilinear system, and determine the legitimacy of the recent U.S. claims. He opened the Ortega claim folder. The documents were beautiful, ornate calligraphy on brittle paper, referencing landmarks that were vivid and alive: the great oak where the river bends, the stone where the sun meets the third peak. These were landmarks of experience, not mathematics. Then he reviewed Elias Vance's deed, precise, cold, and based on a grid system that began thousands of miles away in a place called the Initial Point. Vance's deed measured distance in chains and angles in degrees, ignoring the ancient flow of the river or the presence of the Watcher Redwood. The conflict was clear before he even set the first stake: the confrontation of nature's geometry versus man's geometry. His work began in earnest. For 2 days, Tobias and his crew moved with the slow, almost ceremonial gravity of scientific process. They dragged the heavy surveyor's chain through thick brush, sighting on peaks and plunging into ravines, meticulously measuring the terrain against the existing deeds. On the 3rd day, the evidence began to reveal the heart of the valley's dispute. Tobias discovered that the original Spanish grant to the Ortega family, while vague in its boundaries, was generous in its scope. It encompassed virtually all the fertile meadowland, including the area Elias Vance was currently claiming. However, the American claim was meticulously aligned to the new U.S. Public Land Survey system. Where the two documents overlapped,
a legal time bomb sat buried in the soil. More troubling still was the missing land. As Tobias ran his chain north of the Ortega claim and west of Elias's timber claim, he found a significant parcel of prime riverfront property that appeared to be claimed by neither party, land that was crucial for access to the Pacific Coast Road. It was a vacuum, a loophole that had likely drawn the attention of the fire setters. He was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. It was Sofia Ortega, riding out alone, her face shielded by a wide-brimmed hat. She dismounted near his transit and handed him a small sealed packet. Sofia said, "My father instructed me to bring you the official transcripts of the Rancho Los Robles land decrees. They are translations I made myself, attested by the local priest. I have also included a list of discrepancies I found in the recent government maps." Tobias was surprised by her professionalism and command of English. He took the packet, impressed by the clear, concise legal summaries. "You're a careful student, Miss Ortega," Tobias noted, adjusting his spectacles. "The land descriptions are fluid. Your translations are excellent, but they do not solve the fundamental problem. The U.S. system demands fixed coordinates. Your father's claim is defined by a creek that shifts course every spring." Sofia nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "The creek shifts, Señor Ton, but the rancho remains. A piece of paper should not supersede the life lived on the ground. We have been paying taxes on the land, all of it, for 40 years. Tobias sighed, looking through the lens at the huge, scarred redwood. "The map is a promise, Miss Ortega. The U.S. government promises order and predictability to its settlers. If I honor your father's shifting creek, I undermine the entire system. And if I reject it, I brand your family as squatters." "Which is what the fire setters want," Sofia interjected, leaning closer. "You are looking for the lines of ownership, Señor Torn. I am looking for the lines of attack. The burned brush, the missing property north of the Ortega claim, it is a lure. They're counting on you and Mr. Vance to fight each other so they can steal the most valuable, unclaimed plot." Her insight resonated deeply with Tobias. The cartographer's burden was suddenly heavier than plotting points. It was about predicting human greed. The next day, Elias Vance found Tobias working near the stream, carefully measuring the width of the bank. Elias was carrying a small box of charred metal fragments that he'd recovered from the burned-out barn, evidence of the fire's severity. "Mr. Thorne," Elias said, placing the box down, "I came to ask you a question, not as a surveyor, but as a man of science. This land, the land that I claimed, is it legally mine or not?" Tobias stopped working, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "Your claim, Mr. Vance, is perfectly sound on paper. The survey you purchased is valid, and the PLSS system is the future of land tenure here. However, your claim overlaps the historic Ortega grant by 400 acres. 400 acres which the Ortegas have actively used for livestock and cultivation for years." "So the U.S. government sold me land it didn't fully own?" Elias demanded, his voice rising in frustration. "No," Tobias corrected him patiently. "The U.S. government owns it by right of conquest and cessation, but it inherited an obligation to review and validate existing grants. When the survey lines are drawn, someone will be deemed the imposter. The cost of this open land is that the history and the future are fighting each other for the right to stand here." Elias looked at the charred remnants of his own dream, the stump of the fir he had felled. He handed Tobias the box of metal fragments. "The fire was not an accident, Mr. Thorne. I found these near the stable. They're remnants of an old wagon wheel, a wheel that was deliberately soaked in pitch. This wasn't a warning, it was an attempted land clearance." Tobias picked up a fragment, his fatherly hands turning the piece of scorched iron. "A deliberate act of arson to create a vacancy. This changes the nature of the dispute from a civil boundary issue to a criminal conspiracy." Elias seized the opportunity. "If the land is being threatened by criminals, then the government has a duty to protect it. And if the Ortega claim and my claim are under simultaneous attack, then we are, for the moment, on the same side. But I need to know the official map. Where is the weakness that attracted them?" Tobias hesitated. Revealing incomplete survey data was a breach of his commission. But Sophia's warning and Elias's hard evidence confirmed his suspicion about the unclaimed riverfront. The cartographer's burden demanded he serve the truth, not just the rules. He knelt and quickly drew a rough sketch in the dirt. This is the valley. Here is the Ortega Ranch. Here is your claim. And here, he jabbed his finger at the unmarked space leading toward the coast, is the area that is, by our system, currently vacant. It is prime access to the road. It is the most logical place for an opportunist to establish a foothold while you two fight over the meadow. A staging ground, Elias whispered, seeing the geometry of the betrayal laid out before him. We must act now to ensure that this space remains under U.S. control. Later that evening, Tobias was alone at his camp, carefully inking his findings onto the official parchment. He found himself unable to reconcile the lines. Every straight line drawn by his rule felt like an act of violence against the fluid, breathing reality of the valley. He was trying to map a future, but the past, in the form of the Ortega grant, kept pulling the lines back. He heard a quiet rustle in the trees and reached for the rifle he kept strapped to the tent pole. But it was Alara, the native woman, emerging from the dark, looking like a piece of the night itself. She walked straight to his field table, her eyes scanning the precise mathematical lines of the parchment. She pointed to the massive redwood, the Watcher, which Tobias had marked with an X as an obstacle to his straight survey line. You draw the land with sticks and rope. You make the rivers straight. You make the forest square. I record what is real, according to the law, Tobias responded, his academic composure strained by her unsettling presence. Alara placed her fingertip on a point far to the west of his map, where he had marked an elevation that was, by his count, the highest point in the valley. You are wrong. The highest point is here. She traced a ridge that was barely visible on his map, one he had discounted as a subsidiary peak. My instruments disagree, Tobias countered, a touch of annoyance in his voice. Your transit measures distance, Alara stated simply. It does not measure spirit. That ridge, it is the old gathering place. When the rains come, the water runs from there, bringing life to the whole valley. It is the heart. Tobias looked at her, suddenly seeing his instruments not as tools of truth, but as instruments of limitation. The American system, designed for rapid settlement and clear titles, was fundamentally blind to the ecology and the history that sustained the land. By dismissing Alara's spirit as superstition, he was erasing the markers that had defined the valley for millennia. He picked up a pencil and carefully marked the ridge she had indicated, labeling it Karkin High Point.
The truce between Elias Vance and the Ortega family was a delicate thing, built on a mutual dread of the flames and Sophia's sharp strategic mind. It wasn't trust, it was an acknowledgement that two dogs fighting over a bone only makes it easier for the wolf to snatch it. 2 days after the surveyor, Tobias Thorne, pointed out the map's vacuum, the unclaimed riverfront land, Elias and Sophia set out under the cover of a dense coastal mist. They weren't riding together. Sophia rode 20 yards ahead, the distance a physical manifestation of their ongoing enmity. Her father, Matteo, had grudgingly agreed to let her ride north, convinced by her argument that exposing the arsonists would solidify the Ortega title against any further attacks. Their destination was the Salt Creek Post, a ramshackle, remote trading station 50 miles up the coast, a known haven for trappers, prospectors, and the less savory characters who preferred to conduct business far from the oversight of Monterey. It was the only place in the region where one could reliably purchase the kind of cheap, pre-cut fence lumber that Sophia had identified as the fire's kindling. "We are looking for men who bought pitch and lumber but carried no brand," Sophia called back to Elias, her voice echoing faintly in the fog. "They will be loud, Senor Vance. They will be drunk with the smell of easy opportunity." Elias, riding his heavy draft horse, was focused on his own objective. He carried his heavy rifle and a bag of gold dust, ostensibly for supplies, but truly as bait. He needed a look at the men who saw his valley not as a home, but as a speculation. "We are looking for men who think a fire clears the way. They'll be looking to secure that vacant riverfront before the survey is complete. They'll be buying supplies to set up camp." The Salt Creek Post was less a post, more a collection of shadows.
It was a single, low-slung cabin made of mismatched logs and hides, surrounded by a muddy yard crowded with tethered horses and lean-tos. The sign hanging crookedly above the door, carved crudely in Spanish and English, simply read, "Provisions, Trade, Liquor." Elias and Sophia tethered their horses near a small, perpetually dripping water trough. The scent of stale tobacco, unwashed wool, and cheap rye whiskey hit them immediately. Inside, the light was poor, filtered through greased paper windows and the smoke of a roaring, inefficient fireplace. The owner, a man known only as Caleb, was a huge, silent figure with eyes that missed nothing, standing behind a counter crowded with rusting traps and jars of pickled eggs. There were 7 other men inside, drinking around 2 rough-hewn tables. They were a motley crew, 2 grizzled trappers, a lone, silent Chinese laborer, and a quartet of rougher, louder men whom Elias immediately pegged as the hungry ones. Sophia walked straight to the counter with a practiced confidence that defied her 16 years. Elias followed, staying close but avoiding eye contact, maintaining the role of a detached observer. "We need coffee and feed for 2 horses, Caleb," she said in clear, commanding English, placing a small silver coin on the counter. "And a quiet word about the prices on building supplies. My father is thinking of expanding." "A new shed near the coast road access," Elias cut in, injecting a casual, boastful tone into his voice. "We're setting up a landing site for the coming wave of settlers. Gotta move fast before the government claims it." The boast had its intended effect. The 4 loud men at the table paused their conversation, their eyes narrowing. "Coast road access, eh?" one of them drawled, pushing back his chair. "That land's mighty wet, friend. Might wash away your lumber." "We build on the high ground," Elias retorted, meeting Taggart's stare. "The land between the Ortega Meadow and the northern ridge. Prime spot. Unclaimed as far as the deed books say." Taggart let out a short, nasty laugh, exchanging a glance with his partners. "Seems the deed books ain't caught up with local knowledge, friend. That land's spoken for." The air in the trading post thickened instantly. It was a classic Western standoff, except the weapons weren't drawn. They were implied in the tightening of muscles and the coldness of their eyes. Sophia stepped slightly in front of Elias, her voice dropping to a cool, businesslike tone. "If it's spoken for, then you have wasted your coin. We heard some greenhorns bought a large stock of pitch and lumber here a few days ago, enough to build a fence, or maybe a fire." Taggart's eyes flashed, his hand instinctively resting on his pistol grip. One of his companions, a bulky man with a red flannel shirt, slammed his fist on the table, rattling the tin cups. "You're asking dangerous questions, little girl," he hissed. "We are asking fair questions," Elias countered, keeping his hands visible but his posture solid. "A lot of people got hurt in that fire down in San Gregorio. If you're building on that riverfront, you'd want to know who is clearing the land for you. It's bad luck to profit from arson." The standoff was broken not by violence, but by the quiet arrival of a new patron. Elara, the native woman, slipped through the door. She was cloaked, and her presence seemed to instantly drain the room of its artificial heat. She went straight to the counter, addressing Caleb in the Karkan dialect, asking for salt and dried fish. Her appearance momentarily distracted Taggart, who sneered, "Look at that, the savages are buying supplies too. Soon they'll be selling those baskets for firewood." Elara ignored him entirely, which seemed to infuriate Taggart more than any defiance. Elias seized the opportunity provided by the distraction. He noticed Taggart's boots, new, still bearing the fresh mud of the valley, but underneath the mud, a distinctive white paint stain. It was the same paint Elias had used to blaze his claim lines, the very paint the arsonists would have had to cross to reach the Ortega ranch. "You're far from home, Taggart," Elias said, his voice laced with sudden certainty. "That paint on your boots is from the north side of San Gregorio Creek. You crossed my claim." Taggart realized the mistake instantly. His eyes narrowed, not with general hostility, but with the specific chilling realization that they had been found out, We ride where we want, he growled, rising fully. And you and the little Californiano are riding back, now! The hidden intrigue was over. The shadows and the trading post had coalesced into a clear, imminent danger. The three men with Taggart rose, encircling Elias and Sophia. Caleb, the proprietor, simply retreated to the far end of his counter, his face impassive, an observer, not an ally. The other patrons quickly melted into the corners, wanting no part of the violence. "We're searching your bags," Taggart announced, pulling the pistol halfway from its holster. "If you brought coin, we'll take it. If you brought the law, you'll leave in pieces." Sophia drew a deep breath. She had anticipated violence, but not this sudden, brutal trap. As Taggart stepped toward her, Elias made his move. He did not reach for his rifle. Instead, he reached into his bag, produced the small leather pouch of gold dust, and hurled it with all his strength toward the glowing coals of the fireplace. The move was pure chaos. The leather burst instantly, and the fine gold dust vaporized into the heat, scattering through the chimney and creating a blinding momentary flash of light and a cloud of shimmering, useless glitter. In the split second of shock and temporary blindness, Elias shoved Sophia hard toward the back exit, a small, dark door near the storage shelves. "Go! Get the horses!" Elias yelled, simultaneously ducking low and sweeping a heavy sack of dried beans off the counter, scattering them across the floor in a makeshift, chaotic tripwire. Taggart and his men, blinded by the golden flash and slipping on the rolling beans, were thrown into disarray. Elias drew his rifle, not to shoot, but to use its heavy oak stock as a club. He swung once, cleanly catching the red-shirted man on the side of the head, sending him sprawling into a rack of tinware. "The money is gone!" he shouted, trying to sow confusion. "Check the chimney! It's gone!" He knew the gold was worthless, but the avarice of the thugs was his best weapon. Sophia, meanwhile, had reached the back door. She yanked it open, finding herself in a narrow, muddy alleyway behind the post. She could hear the shouts and the heavy sounds of the brawl behind her. As she sprinted toward their horses, she saw Alara, who had left the front of the post the moment the gold hit the fire, standing near the creek. "They have horses," Alara said, pointing to a set of 3 tethered mounts hidden behind the lean-to. "Horses with supplies packed for a long journey. They are the same men who burned the Ortega stable." Sophia grabbed the reins of her own mare and Elias's horse. "They'll be after us. We need to get back to the valley and warn my father and the surveyor." "No," Alara countered, focusing on Taggart's horses. "They will follow their plan. They only need to delay you. You must make them abandon the pursuit." Alara moved with an alarming swiftness. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a small handful of ground dried mushrooms and herbs, a mixture used for hunting. She smeared the pungent mixture onto the saddles and bridles of Taggart's horses, covering the leather with the natural repellent. "It will drive them mad," she explained, with a fierce look of survival in her eyes. "They will buck and bolt. They will scatter the supplies." A loud crash from inside the post signaled the end of the brawl. Elias burst through the front door, his face cut, his rifle stock dented, but alive. Taggart was shouting orders inside. Elias sprinted to his horse